Emotions, by their very nature, cannot and should not be controlled because they help you survive. Chapter 1: Fear of Death. Why is everyone equal? Because everyone will die. No matter how capable or accomplished a person is, they cannot escape the fear of death. Renowned emperors in history, such as Qin Shi Huang, Emperor Wu of Han, and Augustus of Roman Empire, despite their supreme power, were deeply fearful of death. In their later years, they became obsessed with alchemy and mysticism, seeking immortality. Even religions that seem to transcend the fear of death only shift this fear, they cannot eliminate it from human nature. For example, Christianity claims that although people die, their soul ascend to heaven and achieve eternal life. Hinduism and Buddhism, on the other hand, suggest that while one may die in this life, they will be reborn in the next, which also implies a form of immortality. These religions comfort their followers with the promise of eternal life, leveraging their fear of death without truly eradicating it. If they genuinely intended to remove this fear, they would tell their followers, "When you die, you simply die. You become nothing but decaying flesh." They help them confront and overcome this fear directly. Ultimately, everyone is inherently afraid of death. The fear of death is the most intense of human fears. In fact, every other fear is merely a different expression or degree of this fundamental fear. For instance, many have heard of the uncanny valley effect, the phenomenon where something increasingly human-like evokes greater affection until it becomes too lifelike, at which point it provokes discomfort. This discomfort stems from a fear of corpses. Imagine a primitive society. Encountering a human corpse likely signaled the presence of something lethal nearby, promoting an immediate need to flee. At this core, is still tied back to the fear of death. In this way, the fear of death underpins all human emotions. Chapter 2: Various Derivative Fears. Since all other fears are a form of the fear of death, we can collectively refer to the fears other than the fears of death as quote-unquote derivative fears. To be more precise, we need to define fear. Fear refers to any emotions of rejection, including avoidance, hostility, etc. For example, a person feels hunger, and they reject the state of being hungry. It doesn't necessarily have to be extreme hunger. This can be also considered a form of fear. So why do people fear hunger? Because hunger leads to the lack of nutrition, which ultimately causes the body to stop functioning or even die from malnutrition. So at this core, this is still the fear of death. Why do people avoid eating unpleasant food? Because unpleasant food often indicates that it is spoiled, toxic, or lack nutrition. And eating such food will endanger their survival. Again, this is the fear of death. Why do many people fear the dark? Because darkness signifies the unknown, and this could be dangers we cannot perceive, which still relate to the fear of death. Why do students fear failing exams? Because failing exams could mean they won't be able to earn money or have good living conditions in the future, which threaten their ability to survive. Once again, it's tied to the fear of death. Why do some people fear conflict with others? Because they subconsciously believe their own power is weak, and engaging in conflict with others could lead to being overpowered or quote-unquote taken out, which is still related to the fear of death. Why do people fear to being isolated? In primitive society, humans have to live in groups to survive. Being isolated from the group essentially meant death. Why do some people have social anxiety? They fear their social skills are inadequate, which could lead to isolation and rejection. Why are people afraid of breaking up with their romantic partners? Why are people afraid of being rejected when they confess their love? This is because they believe that the recognition of their romantic partners represents the value of their lives and their control over other lives. Being rejected or breaking up means that they lose these things that enhance their survival. There are many other examples that could be given. If we examine them closely, we will find that all derivative fears ultimately stem from the fear of death. Chapter 3: Fear and Desire. Fear and desire are opposites that are unified, like two sides of the same coin. Desire is another expression of fear. For example, if a person fears death, they will have the desire to live. If a person fears failure, they will have the desire for success. If a person fears loneliness, they will have the desire to find friends. If a person fears the dark, they are driven by the desire to move to a well-lit area. If a person fears conflict, they might choose to avoid it or please the other person. If a student fears an academic failure, they will have the desire to perform well on exams. If a person fears a breakup, they will have a strong desire to maintain the relationship. Of course, there is another more sophisticated form of desire, love, which does not directly stem from fear. However, at its core, it is also a form of fear of death. I will explain this in future later. These desires often form the various emotions outside of fear. In other words, all human emotions can be categorized into two types: fear and desire. Desire can also be seen as a form of fear. The difference between the two is that the fear is an attempt to escape death, while desire is an attempt to enhance survival, which ultimately still boils down to escaping death. In conclusion, it's not difficult to see that emotions are reactions to changes in the external world, responses or coping mechanisms. They are how the brain processes environmental changes in primal rapid way. Therefore, emotional changes can be controlled to some extent, but this control is only a temporary suppression. It does not directly eliminate the emotion. For example, if you feel hungry, you can eat to eliminate the feeling, but you cannot directly command your brain to stop feeling hunger. Thus, emotions are essentially beyond control and should not be suppressed because they help you survive. Chapter 4: Emotions and Interests. Since emotions are an assessment of whether external circumstances are beneficial to your survival, this evaluation must have standard. That standard is your interest, or, in other words, your survival needs. A clarification here: all of the quote-unquote emotions referred to in this series are broad in scope, meaning they include various types of feelings and subconscious responses, not just a narrow sense of joy, anger, sorrow, and happiness. These emotions correspond to specific interests. For example, hunger indicates that body is lacking nutrition, so replenishing nutrition is in line with human interests. If someone laughs at a funny video, this positive emotions alleviates their stress, which is in their best interest. If Peter is scolded by someone and feels very angry, this anger serves to put him in a battle-ready state, preparing to defeat the other person. This aligns with Peter's interests. These emotions drive people to engage in thoughts and behaviors that meets their survival needs. Let's use eating as an example. Fear of death, and then leads to fear of hunger, and it goes to desire to eat, and goes to hunger emotion, and goes to thinking about quote-unquote eating, so that's a thought, and then goes to eating, which is a behavior. This can also be deduced in reverse. If a person wants to eat, is eating, or is looking for food, it indicates that the person is experiencing hunger. And even more interestingly, as I mentioned at the beginning of this article, since everyone has a fear of death, it means that everyone's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors follow this logic. From this, we can infer each person's interest. For instance, if Peter did not do well in exam and is feeling particularly bad and devastated. It shows that he links his exam result with his survival interests, that failing the exam threatens his survival. Further, we can explore why he might feel this threats even through exams results won't actually threaten his life. Further, we can explore why he might feel the threat even though exam result wouldn't actually threaten his life. It could be because he fears being scolded by his parents, or perhaps he feels deeply insecure and believes that only his grades can provide his survival value and prove his abilities. So, if I want to help Peter or utilize him, I can start by addressing this point and give him what he wants, something that aligns with his interests. For example, if we want to help him to stop letting exam affect his mood, we could encourage him to fight with his parents, letting them feel his pain, or help him develop other hobbies and ability to prove his worth in other ways. Alternatively, we might take him out of an environment where he is constantly objectified and judged by others. Another example, when former South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol reformed the healthcare system and expanded medical school admissions, many active doctors were extremely angry and protested in the streets. Behind their anger is the fear that their own survival ability will decline because the new medical students will eventually enter the healthcare industry and take away their share of the profits. It's important to note that these examples in the articles are simplified modules. In reality, a person often experiences multiple emotions at once, and people may hide their emotions for various reasons. However, at any given moment, a person will have one dominant emotion, which corresponds to their most pressing interests. For example, during the Chinese Civil War, many soldiers from the Kuomintang who surrendered were given ideological training by the People's Liberation Army. Initially, the political officers would criticize Chiang Kai-shek, calling him a traitor of the nation. Many soldiers, however, had no strong emotional reaction because they had a positive view of Chiang Kai-shek, since he had paid them their military wages. But when the political officers shifted their focus to the abuse of the lower-ranking soldiers by their officers, the soldiers became deeply moved, with some even reportedly fainting while re-encountering their grievances. This proved that while the accusation of Chiang Kai-shek being a traitor did have some relevance to their interest, but the issue of being mistreated by their officers was their most pressing concern. This principle can guide our communication and approach to work.